The screams stopped when the snow reached their necks. Margaret Sullivan knew she had minutes, maybe less, before the two small figures buried in the drift became just another frontier tragedy. But what she didn't know was that saving them would bring a Lakota warrior to her door and change her life forever. Because in the winter of 1879, when the Colorado Territory was locked in the grip of the worst blizzard anyone could remember, survival wasn't just about staying warm, it was about choosing between the safety of isolation and the dangerous courage of caring for strangers. And sometimes when the wind was howling like a wounded animal and the snow was falling so thick you couldn't see your own hands, the difference between life and death came down to one woman's willingness to risk everything for two children who weren't supposed to matter to her. This is the story of Margaret Sullivan, a frontier school teacher who had learned to live with loneliness after burying her husband the previous winter. For months, she had existed in the careful routine of survival, teaching the handful of children whose families braved the mountain weather, tending her small garden, reading by lamplight through the endless dark hours when the wind reminded her how truly alone she was in the world. And this is the story of Dakota, whose name meant friend to all in the Lakota tongue, but who had spent 3 days riding through a landscape that seemed determined to kill him. Following tracks that kept disappearing under fresh snow, driven by the knowledge that his two younger brothers were somewhere out there in the storm, probably dying, possibly already dead. What neither Margaret nor Dakota expected was how quickly children could become bridges between two worlds that had spent decades treating each other as enemies. How easily a Lakota warrior could kneel in gratitude before a white woman who asked for nothing but the chance to keep someone's children alive. How naturally a woman who had given up on the possibility of family could find herself fighting for two boys who would teach her that love doesn't recognize the color of skin or the boundaries drawn by fear. The blizzard that brought them together was the kind of storm that frontier people talked about for generations, the kind that buried entire settlements under 20 feet of snow, that turned familiar landmarks into alien moonscapes, that made the distance between your front door and your barn feel like a journey across continents. It was the kind of storm that killed everything caught outside its fury, and yet somehow spared two Lakota boys just long enough for a lonely schoolteacher to find them. But storms, even the worst ones, eventually pass. What Margaret discovered as she pulled those small, frozen bodies from the snow was that some rescues rescue the rescuer just as much as the rescued. That sometimes the children who save your life are the ones you choose to love, not the ones you're born to protect. Because when Dakota finally tracked his brothers to a small cabin where a white woman was singing Lakota lullabies she'd learned from 9-year-old Naeli, while 6-year-old Ayana slept peacefully in her arms, he found something he hadn't expected to find in a territory full of people who considered his kind the enemy. He found a woman who had seen two freezing children and never once asked herself whether they deserved to be saved. And in that moment, looking at this stranger who was humming his mother's songs to his baby brother, Dakota realized that some debts could never be repaid with horses or furs or even sacred objects. Some debts could only be honored with the kind of trust that bridges worlds, the kind of love that builds families from the most unlikely materials. But that first night, as Margaret worked frantically to save 2 lives, that protocol said she should have left to the storm. None of that mattered except the simple truth that children were dying and she had the power to stop it. Everything else, the complications, the cultural boundaries, the voice in her head warning her about the consequences of caring too much, would have to wait. Because sometimes love arrives not as a choice, but as an emergency. And Margaret Sullivan had never been the kind of woman to turn away from emergencies, especially when they came small and helpless and desperately in need of someone to believe they were worth saving. The blizzard had been building for 3 days, and Margaret Sullivan knew it was going to be a killer. She'd seen storms before, lived through the winter of '77 when the snow piled so high against her cabin that she'd had to dig a tunnel to reach the woodshed. But this one felt different, angrier. The wind didn't just howl, it shrieked like something in mortal pain, hurling snow with such violence that it sounded like hail against her windows. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the world disappear into white chaos, and tried not to think about how alone she was. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Henderson, 3 miles down the valley, And in weather like this, 3 miles might as well have been 300. The school had been closed for a week, ever since the storm first started building, and Margaret's small world had shrunk to the four walls of her cabin and the 30 feet of rope she'd strung between the house and the barn. She'd been a widow for 11 months now, ever since typhus took David during the spring thaw, and she'd learned to live with silence. But there was something about this storm that made the quiet feel different, heavier, more oppressive, as if the weight of all that snow was pressing down not just on her roof, but on her spirit. That's when she heard it. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks, the way storms could make you hear voices in the howling, make you imagine sounds that weren't there. But then it came again, faint but unmistakable, a human cry, thin and desperate, cutting through the roar of the blizzard. Margaret pressed her face to the frosted glass, trying to see through the wall of white outside. Nothing. Just snow falling so thick it looked like a solid curtain, and wind that bent the pine trees nearly horizontal. Then she heard it again, closer this time. "Help! Please!" The voice was young, high-pitched with fear and cold. A child's voice. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water instantly. The wind tried to knock her sideways, and the snow was falling so hard she could barely see the ground beneath her feet. But she could hear the voice again, and it was coming from somewhere near her fence line. "Where are you?" she called, though her words were immediately swallowed by the storm. "Here! We're here!" Margaret fought her way through knee-deep snow, following the sound of the voice. The wind was vicious, cutting through her coat like it was made of paper, and ice crystals stung her exposed skin like needles. She could feel the cold trying to seep into her bones, and she knew that anyone caught outside in this weather wouldn't last long. That's when she saw them. Two dark shapes huddled against her fence, nearly buried under a drift that had piled up against the wooden rails. At first glance, they looked like debris, maybe bags or bundles that had been blown against the fence by the wind. But then one of them moved, and Margaret realized with horror that she was looking at children. They were both boys, she could see now, with long black hair and skin the color of rich earth. Native children, Lakota most likely, based on their clothing and the traditional patterns she could make out on what remained visible of their coats. The older boy, maybe 9 or 10, was conscious but barely, his lips blue with cold and his whole body shaking violently. The younger one, perhaps 6, lay motionless in his brother's arms. "Oh my God," Margaret breathed, dropping to her knees beside them. The older boy looked up at her with eyes that were glazed with cold and exhaustion. "Please," he whispered through chattering teeth. "My brother." He stopped moving. Margaret's training as a frontier woman kicked in. She'd dealt with hypothermia before. It was one of the leading killers in Colorado Territory, and she knew these children had minutes, not hours, before the cold claimed them completely. "Can you walk?" she asked the older boy, already reaching for his younger brother. I think so." "Then we need to get you inside right now. Hold on to my coat and don't let go." The journey back to the cabin felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. Margaret carried the unconscious child while the older boy clung to her coat, both of them stumbling through snow that seemed determined to drag them down. The wind fought them every step of the way, and twice Margaret was sure they were going to collapse before they reached the door. But finally, blessedly, they were inside. Margaret set the younger boy down on the rug in front of her fireplace and immediately began checking for signs of life. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his skin pale and cold to the touch, but he was alive, barely. "What are your names?" she asked the older boy as she worked, stripping the wet clothes from both children and wrapping them in every blanket she owned. "I'm Nayeli," the boy managed through chattering teeth. "This is my little brother, Ayana." "How long were you out there, Nayeli?" Since yesterday morning, I think. Maybe longer. We got separated from our hunting party when the storm got bad. Ayana fell through the ice on the creek, and by the time I got him out," Nayeli's voice broke. "I couldn't find our way back. Everything looked the same." Margaret nodded grimly. She'd heard stories like this before. Hunting parties caught off guard by sudden weather, families separated when visibility dropped to nothing. Most of those stories didn't end well. She heated water on the stove and began the careful process of warming the boys gradually. Too much heat too fast could be as dangerous as the cold itself. She rubbed their hands and feet, checked their breathing, watched for signs of frostbite. "Is he going to be okay?" Nayeli asked, his dark eyes fixed on his unconscious brother. "I don't know yet," Margaret answered honestly, "but we're going to do everything we can." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret worked with the methodical precision of someone who understood that death could be kept at bay through sheer determination and proper care. She spooned warm broth into Nayeli when he could manage it, monitored Ayana's breathing, and gradually increased the heat in the room until both boys stopped shivering. It wasn't until evening that Ayana finally opened his eyes. "Nayeli," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here, little brother," Nayeli said, immediately moving to take Ayana's hand. "We're safe now. The white woman found us." Ayana's dark eyes found Margaret's face, and she saw fear there. Understandable fear, given that most interactions between his people and hers hadn't been friendly. But she also saw something else, a child's instinctive recognition of someone who meant no harm. "Are you hungry?" Margaret asked gently. Ayana nodded, still watching her warily. Margaret ladled warm soup into a bowl and helped the little boy sit up enough to eat. His hands were still too shaky to hold the spoon himself, so she fed him carefully, making sure he didn't eat too fast or too much. "You speak English well," she observed to Nayeli. "Our brother taught us," Nayeli replied. "He says we need to understand both worlds if we're going to survive." "Your brother? Dakota. He's our guardian since our parents." Nayeli's voice trailed off, and Margaret didn't press. She'd heard enough frontier stories to fill in the blanks. "Is he looking for you?" Nayeli nodded vigorously. "He won't stop until he finds us. Dakota never gives up. But this storm—" He looked toward the window, where snow was still falling heavily. "Even he can't track in this." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Somewhere out there, a man was probably searching for these children in conditions that could kill him. And if he was half as devoted to them as Nayeli seemed to believe, he wouldn't stop looking just because the trail had gone cold. "How far were you from your camp when you got lost?" she asked. "2 days' ride, maybe 3, Nayeli said. "We were tracking elk into the high country when the storm hit." Margaret calculated distances in her head. If the boys had been traveling for 2 days before getting lost, and they'd been wandering for at least another day before she found them, their brother could be anywhere within a 100-mile radius, assuming he was even alive to search for them. "Well," she said finally, "we'll just have to make sure you're both healthy and strong when he finds you." "You're not going to turn us over to the soldiers?" Nayeli asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a potential enemy or a political problem, but a 9-year-old boy who had spent the last day believing his little brother was going to die in his arms. "The only soldiers I'm concerned with right now are the ones fighting to keep you warm and fed," she said firmly. "You're safe here, Nayeli, both of you." For the first time since she'd found them, the tension went out of Nayeli's shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for being brave enough to take care of your brother," Margaret replied. "That took real courage." As night settled over the cabin and the storm continued to rage outside, Margaret found herself looking at the 2 boys sleeping peacefully by her fire and wondering what she'd gotten herself into. She was harboring 2 Lakota children during a time when tensions between whites and Native Americans were at an all-time high. If the wrong people found out, it could mean serious trouble for her. But looking at Ayana's peaceful face and Nayeli's protective posture, even in sleep, Margaret knew she'd made the only choice she could live with. These weren't enemies or political symbols. They were children who needed help, and she was in a position to provide it. The rest she'd figure out when the storm passed and the world became navigable again. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and somewhere in that white wilderness, a Lakota warrior named Dakota was probably still searching for his lost brothers, driven by love and duty through conditions that would stop lesser men. Margaret had no way of knowing that he was closer than she thought, or that when he finally reached her door, he would change everything she thought she knew about family, duty, and the dangerous possibility of love blooming in the most unlikely places. The storm raged for 3 more days, and in that time, Margaret Sullivan's small cabin became something she'd never expected it to be, a home. It started with the small things. Nayeli's careful way of testing each spoonful of soup before deciding it was safe to eat. Ayana's startled jump every time the wind rattled the windows, followed by his instinctive reach for his brother's hand. The way both boys watched her movements with the alert wariness of creatures who'd learned that survival meant paying attention to everything. On the second morning, Margaret woke to find Nayeli sitting by the fire, fully dressed and staring at the door. "You don't have to keep watch," she said gently, settling into the chair beside him. "You're safe here." "Dakota says a warrior is always ready," Nayeli replied, not taking his eyes off the door. "He says being safe and being ready are two different things." Margaret studied the boy's profile, noting the tension in his small shoulders, the way his hand instinctively rested near the hunting knife he'd been carrying when she found them. 9 years old and already carrying the weight of adult responsibilities. "How long have you been taking care of Ayana?" "Since the fever took our parents 2 winters ago. Dakota was already a man then, but he said we were his responsibility now. He taught me to hunt, to track, to read the weather." Nayeli's voice cracked slightly. "But I couldn't even keep us from getting lost in a storm." "You kept your brother alive for 2 days in conditions that would have killed grown men," Margaret said firmly. "That's not failure, Nayeli. That's courage." The boy finally looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth or just being kind. "Dakota says white people lie," he said quietly, "that they make promises they don't mean." Margaret felt a stab of pain at the casual way he delivered this judgment, and at the fact that she couldn't honestly argue with it. The history between their peoples was written in broken treaties and betrayed trusts. "Some do," she admitted, "just like some Lakota probably lie sometimes too. But I'm not lying about this. You saved your brother's life." That afternoon, while Ayana napped by the fire, Nayeli began to open up. He told her about their camp, about the way Dakota taught them to read animal tracks in the mud and to find direction by the stars. He spoke with the mixture of pride and hero worship that children reserve for the adults who meant everything to them. "He's the best tracker in our band," Nayeli said, carefully arranging the wooden blocks Margaret had carved for Ayana. "Some say he can follow a trail even when there is no trail. That's why he'll find us, even in the storm." "You love him very much." "He's not just our brother. He's our father, our teacher, our protector. When the other warriors said we were too young for the elk hunt, Dakota said we were ready. He said we needed to learn to provide for ourselves." Nayeli's face darkened. "Now he'll think he was wrong to trust us?" Margaret's heart ached for this child who was carrying guilt that belonged to the weather, not to him. "Do you really think your brother would blame you for something you couldn't control?" Nayeli considered this. "No," he said finally. "Dakota says the spirits control the storms, but he'll still blame himself for letting us come." It was on the third day that Ayana spoke his first complete sentence. Margaret was teaching Nayeli a simple card game when the younger boy suddenly looked up from the picture book he'd been studying and said, "Why do you have sad eyes?" Margaret blinked, startled both by the question and by the directness of it. "What do you mean?" "Your eyes," Ayana said, pointing at her face with the serious expression of a child making an important observation. "They're like Dakota's eyes after Mama and Papa went to the spirit world. Happy on the outside, but sad underneath." Nayeli shot his brother a warning look. "Ayana, it's not polite to—" "It's okay," Margaret said softly. She looked at this 6-year-old who had somehow seen past her careful composure to the grief she thought she'd hidden. "You're very observant, Ayana. Yes, I am sad sometimes. I lost someone too." "Your husband," Nayeli said. It wasn't a question, Margaret nodded. "He died last spring. Sickness." "Do you miss him?" Ayana asked. "Every day." Ayana climbed down from his chair and walked over to Margaret. Without a word, he climbed into her lap and wrapped his small arms around her neck in a hug that was both comfort offered and comfort sought. "Hugs help with the sad," he said matter-of-factly. "Dakota taught us that." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she returned the embrace. When was the last time someone had hugged her? When was the last time she'd felt needed, not just useful? Your brother sounds like a very wise man, she managed to say. He is, Ayana said confidently, and he's coming for us. I can feel it. That evening, as Margaret prepared dinner, she found herself humming, something she hadn't done since David died. The boys were playing a Lakota stick game that Nayeli had taught Ayana, their laughter filling the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. But as the storm finally began to weaken on the fourth day, Margaret's contentment was overshadowed by a growing anxiety. What would happen when the weather cleared? When the outside world intruded on this small bubble of peace they'd created? She knew the boys belonged with their people, with their brother who was probably half crazy with worry by now. But the thought of returning to her empty cabin, to the silence and loneliness that had been her companions for nearly a year, felt almost unbearable. More troubling were the other concerns that kept her awake at night. What if someone from town saw the boys? What if word got back to the territorial authorities that she was harboring Native children? The relationship between whites and Lakota in this part of Colorado was tense on the best of days, and there were plenty of people who would see her actions as treasonous. But worse than the fear of official repercussions was the fear of what the boy's brother might think when he found them. Would he see her as their savior, or as just another white woman who had taken something that didn't belong to her? You're worried, Niley observed that evening as they sat by the fire. Both boys were clean, well-fed, and noticeably healthier than they'd been when she found them, but she could see that Nayeli was beginning to wrestle with worries of his own. A little, Margaret admitted. I want to make sure you get home safely. Dakota will come, Nayeli said with absolute certainty. But when he does... What? The boy hesitated, then said quietly, he might not understand why you helped us. Our people and your people, we haven't been friends for a long time. Margaret looked at this wise 9-year-old who was trying to prepare her for the possibility that his beloved brother might not appreciate her kindness. Are you worried about what he'll think of me? She asked. I'm worried about what you'll think of him, Nayeli replied. Dakota is intense. He doesn't trust easily, especially not white people. He's seen too much, lost too much. When he's protecting something he loves, he can seem... The boy searched for the right word. Dangerous. Are you afraid of him? No. Niley's response was immediate and emphatic. Never. Dakota would die before he'd hurt us. But he might seem scary to you. I don't want you to be afraid when he comes. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the cabin. She was harboring 2 Lakota children, and their guardian was described as a man who didn't trust her people and could seem dangerous when protecting what he loved. Nayeli, she said carefully, when your brother comes, will he think I took you against your will? The boy's eyes widened as he understood what she was really asking. You think he'll hurt you? I think I need to understand what I'm facing. Nayeli was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and much older than his years. Dakota will see that we're safe, healthy, happy. He'll see that you fed us, healed us, treated us with kindness. And then he'll know what kind of person you are. The boy looked at her with eyes that held wisdom born of loss and hardship. My brother is not an evil man, Margaret. He's just a man who has learned that the world is full of people who would hurt the things he loves. But he's also fair. When he sees the truth, he'll accept it. And what is the truth? That you saved our lives when you could have left us to die. That you asked for nothing in return. That you treated us like... Nayeli paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. Like we mattered. Margaret felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. You do matter. Both of you. Ayana, who had been pretending to be asleep, suddenly piped up from his nest of blankets. Dakota will like you, Margaret. I dreamed it. You dreamed it? Margaret asked, amused despite her anxiety. Uh-huh. He was smiling, and you were smiling, and there were flowers. Ayana's voice was getting sleepy again. Lots and lots of flowers. Niley rolled his eyes. Ayana thinks all dreams mean something good is going to happen. Maybe they do, Margaret said softly, tucking the blankets around the younger boy. Maybe they do. But as she lay in her own bed that night, listening to the wind finally beginning to calm outside, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that when Dakota arrived, and she was becoming increasingly certain that he would, everything about her carefully ordered life was going to change. She just wasn't sure whether that change would bring the flowers from Ayana's dream or something far more complicated than a 6-year-old's hopeful imagination could envision. Dakota had been tracking his brothers for 4 days, and the storm was trying to kill him. It had started as a routine elk hunt, something he'd done 100 times before, something he'd been doing since he was younger than Nayeli was now. His brothers had been eager to prove themselves, to show they could contribute to the band's winter stores, and Dakota had seen no reason to deny them the chance. They were good boys, careful and observant, and he'd taught them well. But the storm had come out of nowhere. One moment they'd been following a fresh elk trail through the high meadows. The next they were being lashed by winds that came screaming down from the peaks with the fury of angry spirits. Dakota had called for them to turn back, to find shelter until the weather passed. But in the confusion and the rapidly deteriorating visibility, they'd been separated. When the wind finally died down enough for him to search, his brothers were gone. That had been 4 days ago, and Dakota hadn't stopped looking since. He'd pushed his horse until the animal could barely stand, then continued on foot when the snow became too deep for riding. His food was gone. His water was nearly frozen solid in its pouch. His hands were so cold inside his mittens that he could barely feel his fingers, and ice had formed in his beard from his own breath. But none of that mattered. Nothing mattered except finding Nayeli and Ayana before the cold claimed them. The trail had gone cold on the second day, obliterated by fresh snowfall and wind that rearranged the landscape every few hours. Since then, Dakota had been searching in expanding circles, following his instincts and the prayers he whispered to his ancestors with every step. Other men would have given up by now. Other men would have acknowledged that 2 children couldn't survive this long in conditions that were killing full-grown warriors. But Dakota wasn't other men. He was the brother who had promised his dying mother that he would protect Nayeli and Ayana with his life. He was the guardian who had raised them from babies, taught them to walk and hunt and see themselves as worthy of the name they carried. He was the man who would rather die searching than live knowing he had abandoned them. On the morning of the 5th day, Dakota finally caught a break. The storm had moved on during the night, leaving behind a landscape that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the first clear sky he'd seen in nearly a week. And there, barely visible in a sheltered draw about a mile ahead, he spotted the thin column of smoke that meant civilization. His heart hammered against his ribs as he forced his exhausted legs to carry him toward that precious sign of human habitation. It was probably a white settlement. They were the only ones who built permanent structures this far into the mountains. But right now he didn't care about the color of the people who might have found his brothers. All that mattered was the possibility that Nayeli and Ayana were alive and warm somewhere at the base of that smoke column. The cabin, when he finally reached it, was smaller than he'd expected, but well built and clearly occupied. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, and he could see light glowing behind curtained windows. For a moment, Dakota simply stood in the snow outside the fence, overwhelmed by a mixture of hope and terror. What if his brothers weren't here? What if this was just another false lead in a search that had already taken him across half the territory? What if they were here, but they were already dead? Dakota pushed that thought away before it could take root. He'd know if his brothers were gone, would feel it in his bones the way he'd felt his parents' deaths even before the messenger reached their camp. The connection between him and the boys ran deeper than blood. It was forged from years of shared responsibility, shared love, shared survival. He was still trying to work up the courage to approach the cabin when he heard something that made his knees nearly buckle with relief. Laughter. Children's laughter, high and bright and unmistakably alive. Dakota closed his eyes and offered a prayer of gratitude so profound it left him shaking. Then he straightened his shoulders, checked his weapons, and walked toward the cabin with the measured steps of a man who understood that everything he cared about in the world might depend on the next few minutes. He was 20 feet from the door when it opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was white, as he'd expected, with honey-colored hair and skin that had been touched by sun and wind, but not hardened by it. She wore a simple brown dress and a blue shawl, and she moved with the confident ease of someone comfortable in her own space, But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Green eyes that were cautious but not afraid, measuring but not hostile. This was not what he'd expected to find. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the fact that she was facing a Lakota warrior who probably looked like something out of her worst nightmares. Dakota knew how he must appear to her, wild-haired and ice-covered, his traditional clothing marking him as clearly as war paint, weapons visible on his belt and across his back. He'd been tracking for days through conditions that would have broken most men, and he undoubtedly looked like exactly the kind of savage she'd been taught to fear. But her hand wasn't on a weapon, and she wasn't calling for help. She was just standing there, waiting for him to speak, as if the sight of a Lakota warrior on her doorstep was nothing more than an unexpected but manageable problem. "I am looking for two boys," Dakota said carefully, his English rusty from disuse but clear enough. "My brothers. They were lost in the storm." The woman's expression shifted, and for a moment Dakota saw something flicker across her face. Relief? Recognition? Before he could identify it, she was speaking again. "How old are they?" 9 and 6. Dark hair traveling together. The older one carries a hunting knife with an eagle carved on the handle. "What are their names?" Dakota hesitated. Names had power, and giving them to a stranger felt like handing over pieces of his brother's souls. But if this woman had found them, if she was the reason that smoke was rising from the chimney and children were laughing inside. "Nayeli and Ayanna," he said quietly. The change in the woman's face was immediate and dramatic. Her caution melted away, replaced by something that looked almost like joy. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. I was praying someone would come for them." Dakota felt his legs go weak with relief so profound it was almost painful. "They are here? They are alive? They're here and they're safe. Cold and hungry when I found them, but they're going to be fine." The woman stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Please come in. They've been asking about you every day." Dakota didn't move. He couldn't. The relief was too overwhelming, and there were too many questions crowding his mind. Why was this white woman being kind to him? Why wasn't she afraid? What did she want in return for caring for his brothers? "You found them," he said, needing to understand. "In the storm. You brought them inside." "I did." "Why?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Because they were children who needed help." "They are Lakota children." "They are children," she repeated, and there was steel in her voice now. That's all that mattered. Dakota studied her face, looking for the lie, the hidden agenda, the trap that experience had taught him was always there when white people offered kindness to his people. But all he saw was a woman who seemed genuinely puzzled by his suspicion, as if the idea of leaving children to die in a blizzard was so foreign to her that she couldn't imagine anyone else considering it. "What is your name?" he asked. "Margaret Sullivan, and you must be Dakota. The boys have told me a great deal about you." Before Dakota could respond, the door burst open and two small figures launched themselves at him with cries of joy that echoed across the snow-covered yard. "Dakota, you found us! We knew you would!" Dakota dropped to his knees in the snow, gathering his brothers into his arms with a desperation that spoke of 4 days of fearing he'd lost them forever. He buried his face in their hair, breathing in their familiar scent, feeling their solid warmth against his chest. "I was so afraid," he whispered in Lakota, not caring that the white woman could hear the crack in his voice. "I thought I had lost you." "We knew you'd come," Nayeli said, pulling back to look at his brother's face. "I told Margaret you were the best tracker in the territory, that you'd never stop looking for us." "Margaret?" Dakota looked up at the woman still standing on the porch, watching their reunion with an expression of such genuine happiness that it made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. "She saved our lives," Ayanna said seriously. "Found us buried in the snow and brought us inside and fed us soup and told us stories and—" "She's been taking care of us," Nayeli interrupted, shooting his younger brother a look that suggested this conversation had been planned. "Good care. Like family." Dakota rose slowly, his brothers still clinging to his sides, and faced the woman who had given him back everything that mattered in the world. The debt he owed her was beyond calculation, beyond repayment. But looking at her now, at the way she was smiling, as if his joy was somehow her own. He found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she hadn't done it for the debt at all. "Margaret," he said, tasting her name carefully, "I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything," she replied, "but you look like you're about to fall over. Come inside, get warm, get fed. We can talk about everything else later." Dakota looked at this woman who had saved his brothers and was now offering to care for him as well, and felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been frozen solid for 4 days of desperate searching beginning to thaw. "Later," he agreed, and followed her into the warm light of the cabin that had become, for reasons he didn't yet understand, the most important place in his world. The first thing Dakota noticed when he stepped inside Margaret's cabin was the warmth. Not just the physical heat radiating from the fireplace, but something deeper, more profound. The space felt lived in, cared for, safe in a way that went beyond mere shelter from the storm. The second thing he noticed was how comfortable his brothers looked. Naili and Ayana had settled into the domestic rhythm of the place, with an ease that spoke of days spent feeling secure. Their clothes were clean and dry. Their faces had the healthy color of children who'd been eating well, and they moved around the cabin with the confident familiarity of guests who had been made to feel genuinely welcome. It was Ayana who broke the spell of awkward politeness that had settled over the three adults. "Dakota, look!" the 6-year-old announced, tugging on his brother's coat and pointing toward a corner of the room where several wooden toys were scattered near a small chair. "Margaret made these for us. This one's a horse, and this one's a bear, and she said she'd carve a wolf tomorrow if I helped her with the dishes." Dakota looked at the simple but skillfully carved animals, then at the woman who had taken the time to create toys for children who weren't hers, and felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with recognition. "You made these?" he asked Margaret. "It's nothing special," she replied, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "They needed something to occupy their time while they recovered." "They're beautiful," Dakota said, and meant it. Each carving showed attention to detail and craftsmanship that spoke of someone who understood the importance of giving children things to wonder about and cherish. "Margaret tells the best stories too," Naili added, settling cross-legged on the rug by the fire. "She knows about the thunder beings and the talking animals. She's been learning our words." "Learning your words?" Margaret's cheeks flushed slightly. "The boys have been teaching me some Lakota phrases. I thought if I was going to care for them, I should try to understand their language." Dakota stared at her. In his experience, white people expected everyone else to learn English, not the other way around. The idea that this woman had spent time learning his language just to better communicate with two lost children was so foreign to his expectations that he found himself struggling to process it. "Say something," Ayana demanded, bouncing slightly with excitement. "Show Dakota how good you are." Margaret looked embarrassed but game. She took a breath and said carefully but clearly, "Mitakuye o yasing, washte yanka." All my relations. It is good. The pronunciation was careful, deliberate, and while not perfect, it was respectful in a way that told Dakota she understood she was using sacred words, not just making sounds. "Your accent needs work," he said quietly, "but your intention is clear." "I hope I didn't offend." "You didn't." Dakota found himself studying her face. This woman who had learned sacred phrases to comfort children who weren't her own. "Who taught you to say that?" "Naili. He said it was something you say when you want to honor all living things." "And why did you want to learn it?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, her green eyes thoughtful. "Because when someone is far from home and frightened, hearing words in their own language can be like a bridge back to safety." Dakota felt his throat tighten. This woman understood something about displacement and longing that most white people never even considered. She had seen his brother's need not just for physical care, but for cultural comfort, and she had tried to provide it. "You must be exhausted," Margaret said, seeming to sense that the conversation was becoming too intense. "And hungry. Let me get you something warm." She bustled around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency, and soon Dakota found himself sitting at her table with a bowl of venison stew that was better than anything he'd tasted in weeks. His brothers sat on either side of him, chattering about their adventures with Margaret, their relief at his arrival, their eagerness to show him everything she had taught them. But even as he listened to their voices and felt his body begin to relax for the first time in days, Dakota found his attention drawn again and again to the woman moving quietly around her cabin. Margaret Sullivan was not what he had expected to find at the end of his desperate search. She was younger than her competence suggested, probably close to his own age. Her movements were graceful but practical, and there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself that spoke of someone who had learned to rely on her own capabilities. But it was the way she looked at his brothers that undid him completely. There was no condescension in her gaze, no fear, no sense that she was doing them a favor by tolerating their presence. She looked at Nayeli and Ayana the way a mother looked at children she genuinely cared about, with affection, with concern, with the kind of protective tenderness that couldn't be faked. "How long were you planning to let them stay?" Dakota asked when the boys had finished eating and were occupied with showing him a card game Margaret had taught them. "As long as they needed to," she replied without hesitation, "until they were fully recovered, until someone came for them." She paused, then added more quietly, "until they felt safe." "And if no one had come?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "Then I would have cared for them until they were old enough to make their own choices about where they belonged." The simple certainty in her voice hit Dakota like a physical blow. This woman would have raised his brothers, would have given them a home, an education, a chance at a life that bridged two worlds. Not out of obligation or charity, but because she had seen two children in need and opened her heart to them. "Why?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended, driven by emotions he couldn't quite name. "Why would you take that risk? Why would you care for children who aren't your blood, your people, your responsibility?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but sure. "Because love isn't about blood, Dakota. It's about choice, and every day I chose to love them a little more." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, and completely devastating in their simplicity. Dakota stared at this woman who spoke of love as easily as she spoke of the weather, who had opened her home and her heart to two Lakota children without asking for anything in return. "You said you're alone here," he said finally. "My husband died last spring. Typhus. I'm sorry." "Thank you." Margaret glanced toward the boys who were now curled up together on the rug, Ayana's head pillowed on Niley's shoulder as they dozed in the warmth. "They've been good company, better than I expected. They're good boys." "They are. They're also boys who love their brother very much. They've talked about you constantly, your wisdom, your strength, your devotion to them. They think you hung the moon." Dakota felt heat rise in his cheeks. "They exaggerate. Do they?" Margaret turned to look at him fully, and Dakota found himself caught by the directness of her gaze. "You rode for 4 days through a blizzard that should have killed you. You didn't stop, didn't give up, didn't even consider the possibility that they might not be found. That sounds like devotion to me." "They're my family." "Exactly." Margaret smiled, and Dakota felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the sight. "Family is worth any risk, any sacrifice. I think you and I understand that about each other." Outside, the wind had died down to almost nothing, and through the windows Dakota could see stars beginning to appear in the clearing sky. The storm that had brought his brothers to this place was finally, truly over. But looking at Margaret Sullivan, at the way she'd cared for his brothers, the way she spoke of love and choice and family, Dakota suspected that his own storm was just beginning. "We should leave in the morning," he said, though the words felt wrong coming out of his mouth. "Of course," Margaret replied, but something flickered across her face. Disappointment? Sadness? "I'll pack some food for the journey." "Margaret," Dakota found himself saying, "what you've done for them, for us, there are no words in English or Lakota for this kind of debt." "There's no debt," she said firmly. There's just gratitude that I was here when they needed help, that I was able to give them something they needed." Dakota looked at his sleeping brothers, then back at the woman who had saved them, cared for them, loved them without reservation or expectation. And for the first time in his adult life, He found himself wondering what it would be like to stay in one place, to build something that lasted beyond the next hunt or the next season, to build something with someone who understood that family was about choice, not just blood. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I think you gave them something I didn't even know they needed." "What's that?" Dakota met her eyes, saw the kindness there, the strength, the possibility of something he'd never dared to imagine for himself. "A chance to be loved by someone who chose them," he said, "not because she had to, but because she wanted to." And in the silence that followed, with his brothers sleeping peacefully by the fire, and Margaret Sullivan looking at him with eyes that held more warmth than he'd ever expected to find in this harsh territory, Dakota began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he might have found something he didn't even know he'd been searching for. Morning came bright and clear, the first truly beautiful day since the storm began. Dakota woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of his brother's laughter mixing with a woman's voice in quiet conversation. For a moment, he simply lay on the makeshift bed Margaret had prepared for him near the fireplace, listening to the domestic symphony of a peaceful household. When was the last time he'd woken to such sounds? When was the last time morning had meant anything other than the beginning of another day of survival? "Dakota's awake," Ayana announced, having spotted his open eyes from across the room. "Good morning," Margaret said, turning from the stove with a smile that made something warm spread through his chest. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in years," Dakota admitted, sitting up and running a hand through his hair. It was more honesty than he'd intended to share, but something about this woman seemed to pull truth from him without effort. "I was just telling the boys about the elk migration patterns in this valley," Margaret said, setting a plate of food in front of him. "I thought you might be interested in the hunting grounds here." Dakota looked at her in surprise. Most white women he'd encountered acted as if hunting was something distasteful, primitive. But Margaret spoke of it with the practical interest of someone who understood its necessity. "You know about hunting?" "My husband taught me to track and shoot before he died. Out here, those aren't optional skills for a woman alone." Margaret refilled his coffee cup with steady hands. "I've been watching the deer paths behind the cabin, and I think there might be a decent-sized herd wintering in the next valley over." Dakota found himself studying her with new eyes. This woman wasn't just capable of caring for children. She was a survivor in her own right, someone who had adapted to frontier life with practical intelligence rather than romantic notions about civilized domesticity. "Show me," he said impulsively. Margaret blinked. "What?" "The deer paths. Show me what you've observed." An hour later, they were walking through the snow-covered forest behind Margaret's cabin, while the boys played in the yard under Niley's watchful supervision. Dakota moved through the woods with the silent grace of someone born to this environment, but he was impressed to discover that Margaret could read sign almost as well as he could. "There," she said quietly, pointing to a barely visible depression in the snow near a stand of aspen trees. "They've been bedding down here regularly. You can see where they've worn the ground smooth." Dakota knelt beside the sign, studying the subtle indicators that told the story of deer behavior in this area. Margaret was right. This was a well-used resting spot, and the tracks leading away from it suggested a healthy population of animals. "How did you learn to see this?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Necessity," Margaret replied with a slight smile, "and a husband who refused to let me be helpless just because I was born female." David believed that knowledge was survival, and ignorance was just another way to die out here. "Your husband sounds like a wise man?" "He was." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "He would have liked you, I think. He appreciated people who understood the difference between existing and truly living." Dakota looked at her, really looked at her, standing there in the dappled sunlight filtering through the pine boughs, her cheeks pink from the cold, and her eyes bright with intelligence and warmth. She wasn't classically beautiful in the way white society defined such things, but there was something about her that drew him like gravity. "Margaret," he said quietly, "why are you really showing me this?" She was quiet for a moment, her gaze focused on the distant mountains. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Because I think you're trying to decide whether to stay or go, and I want you to know that staying is possible, that there's a life here if you want it." The honesty of her words hit him like a physical blow. She had seen right through his careful politeness to the conflict he'd been wrestling with since the moment he'd found his brothers safe in her care. "It's not that simple," he said. "Isn't it?" Dakota turned to face her fully. "I'm Lakota, Margaret. My people are at war with yours. There are settlements in this territory where I'd be shot on sight, regardless of my intentions. Not by me. What about your neighbors? What about the authorities?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Dakota could see her weighing his words against realities she understood better than he'd given her credit for. "You're right," she said finally. "It wouldn't be easy. There would be risks, complications, people who wouldn't understand." She paused, then looked at him with eyes that held more courage than fear. "But there would also be mornings like this one. There would be your brothers growing up safe and loved. There would be—" "What?" "There would be the possibility of something good, something real." Dakota felt his chest tighten. "And you would risk all of that? Your safety, your reputation, your standing in the community? For the right reasons, yes." "What would be the right reasons?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and Dakota saw something shift in her expression. A decision being made, a wall being lowered. "Love," she said simply. "Love would be the right reason." The word hung between them in the crisp mountain air, honest and vulnerable, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Dakota stared at this woman who had just laid her heart open to him, who was offering him not just shelter, but the possibility of a future he'd never dared to imagine. "Margaret, I know it's complicated," she said quickly. "I know there would be challenges, dangers, people who would try to tear apart whatever we built. But Dakota, I've spent the last year learning to live with loneliness, and these past few days with you and your brothers, I've remembered what it feels like to be part of something larger than just surviving." Dakota found himself stepping closer to her, drawn by the courage it must have taken to speak such words to a man whose people she was supposed to fear. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "You don't know what I've done, what I've seen. I'm not the gentle man you might imagine. I know you rode 4 days through a killer storm to find your brothers. I know you raised them with love and wisdom and strength. I know you speak to them with patience and respect." Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. "And I know that when you look at me, you see someone worth protecting, someone worth considering." She was right, and the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Somewhere in the span of less than 24 hours, this white woman had become important to him in ways that defied logic or caution. "What about the boys?" he asked. "What about their future?" "They would have both worlds," Margaret said without hesitation. "Your culture, your language, your traditions, and also safety, education, opportunities that might not exist if they stayed with your band." "You would do that? Help them maintain their identity even while raising them in white society?" "Dakota, their identity isn't something that needs to be maintained. It's something that should be celebrated. They're proud of who they are, and they should be." Dakota felt something fundamental shift inside him as he looked at this woman who understood what so many others missed. That love didn't require erasure, that acceptance didn't mean abandoning who you were. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough with emotions he was still afraid to name, "if I stayed, if we tried to build something here, I wouldn't just be risking my own safety. I'd be risking yours too." "I know. And you're willing to take that risk?" Margaret stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough to smell the faint scent of pine and lavender that seemed to cling to her hair. "For you," she said softly. "For them? For the chance to be part of a real family again?" "Yes, Dakota. I'm willing to take that risk." And standing there in the snow-covered forest, with this remarkable woman offering him everything he'd never known he wanted, Dakota finally admitted to himself what he'd been fighting since the moment he'd seen her gentle hands caring for his brothers. He was willing to take that risk too. 3 months later, Margaret Sullivan woke to the sound of children's laughter and the smell of coffee brewing over a fire that never went cold. But it wasn't Margaret Sullivan anymore. It was Margaret Dakota, wife to a Lakota warrior, mother to 2 boys who called her Ina and meant it with their whole hearts. She stretched in the bed she now shared with a man whose presence had transformed her small cabin from a place of survival into a true home, and smiled at the domestic sounds of her new family beginning their day. The decision hadn't been easy. In the days following their conversation in the forest, Dakota had wrestled with the implications of staying, not just for himself, but for his brothers and for her. Margaret had watched him pace her cabin like a caged wolf, weighing love against duty, possibility against probability. It was Naeli who had finally settled the matter. Dakota, the 9-year-old had said one evening as they sat around the fire, "If you take us back to the band, we'll always remember the white woman who saved our lives. But if we stay here, we can have a family again. A real family." "You don't understand the complications," Dakota had begun. "I understand that Margaret loves us," Ayanna had interrupted with 6-year-old certainty. "And I understand that you love her too. I can see it in how you look at each other. Out of the mouths of babes." That night, Dakota had taken Margaret's hand and spoken the words that changed everything. "If you'll have us, all of us, I want to try to build something here. Something that belongs to all our worlds." The wedding ceremony 3 weeks later had been unlike anything the Colorado Territory had ever seen. Margaret wore her mother's white dress. Dakota wore traditional Lakota wedding regalia that had belonged to his father, and they exchanged vows in both English and Lakota under an arch made of pine boughs and winter roses. The witnesses were few but significant. Mrs. Henderson from down the valley, who had surprised everyone by declaring that any woman brave enough to save children in a blizzard deserved happiness. Pastor Mitchell, who had initially balked at performing a mixed marriage, but changed his mind after meeting Dakota and seeing the way he treated Margaret and the boys. And a delegation of 3 Lakota elders who had ridden down from Dakota's band to witness their warrior choosing love over tradition. The challenges had been real. There were whispered conversations in town, cold stares from some of the more narrow-minded settlers, and at least one awkward visit from a territorial official who seemed to think Margaret might be under some kind of duress. But there had also been unexpected support. Dr. Williams, who appreciated Dakota's knowledge of traditional healing practices. The Miller family, whose youngest son had been saved from drowning by Naeli's quick thinking and even quicker action. The growing number of people who saw past the differences to recognize a family that was raising good children and contributing to the community. "Ina," Ayanna called from the main room, "Dakota says to tell you the coffee's ready and Naeli caught 3 fish for breakfast." Margaret, Ina, smiled and rose from bed, pulling on the warm robe Dakota had made for her from soft deer hide, decorated with beadwork and patterns that told the story of their unlikely courtship. She found her family gathered around the table, Dakota serving fish with the easy competence of someone comfortable in both wilderness and domestic settings, while Naeli regaled them with the tale of his morning fishing expedition. Ayanna was carefully arranging wildflowers in a jar, his contribution to making every meal feel like a celebration. "Good morning, wife," Dakota said, rising to pour her coffee and steal a quick kiss that still made her heart flutter after 3 months of marriage. "Good morning, husband," Margaret replied, settling into the chair that had become hers at this table that now belonged to all of them. As they ate breakfast and planned their day, Dakota would check the trap lines, Naeli would help Margaret with the garden she was expanding for spring planting, Ayanna would continue his reading lessons. Margaret reflected on the strange turns life could take. A year ago, she had been a lonely widow, existing rather than living, convinced that happiness was something that happened to other people. Now she was part of a family that defied every convention, challenged every assumption, and somehow worked better than anything she could have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Dakota asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "Just this," Margaret gestured around the table, encompassing the boys arguing good-naturedly about fishing techniques, the comfortable domesticity, the sense of belonging that filled every corner of the cabin. "How sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances." "You mean the storm?" "I mean everything. The storm, yes, but also losing David, your parents' deaths, all the painful things that led us to this place where we could find each other." Dakota reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb tracing across the simple gold band she wore alongside the traditional Lakota marriage bracelet he had given her. My grandmother used to say that the spirits sometimes send storms not to destroy, but to clear the path for something new to grow. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was, and she would have loved you. After breakfast, as Dakota and Nayeli prepared for their morning hunt and Ayana settled in with his books, Margaret stood at her kitchen window looking out at the valley that had become her world. The snow was melting now, revealing the green shoots of new grass and the first wildflowers of spring. In a few weeks, the path to town would be fully clear, and they would face whatever challenges the outside world brought to their door. But they would face them together. The Lakota warrior who had learned that home wasn't a place, but the people you chose to love. The frontier woman who had discovered that family could be built from courage and compassion rather than just blood. And the two boys who served as living proof that love really could bridge any divide. Ina, Ayana called from his spot by the fire. Will you tell us the story again? About the night you found us? Margaret smiled, settling into her chair as Dakota and Nayeli joined them, all of them eager to hear once more the tale of how their family had been born from a blizzard and built on the revolutionary idea that love was always worth the risk. It started with a storm, Margaret began, the same way she always did, looking around at the faces of the people who had become her whole world. The kind of storm that changes everything. And outside, spring continued its inevitable arrival, bringing with it the promise of new growth, new possibilities, and the endless potential that came from choosing love over fear, family over loneliness, and hope over despair. Because sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the courage to save a stranger, and sometimes the most unlikely families were forged in the fires of storms that cleared the way for miracles to grow. And so, beneath the endless Colorado sky, another tale finds its place among the legends of the Wild West, a story that reminds us that sometimes the most powerful force on the frontier wasn't gunpowder or gold, but the simple courage to see past differences to the humanity that connects us all. Margaret and Dakota's story didn't end with that spring morning around their breakfast table. Historical records from the Colorado Territory show that their unusual family became a cornerstone of their community for over 4 decades. Margaret became the territory's first licensed female doctor, combining traditional frontier medicine with Lakota healing practices that Dakota taught her. Their sons, Nayeli and Ayana, grew up to become bridges between two worlds. Nayeli as a translator and peace negotiator, Ayana as a teacher who founded the first bilingual school in the region. But perhaps most remarkably, their marriage sparked what historians now call the Sullivan-Dakota model, a peaceful integration approach that influenced territorial policy and helped establish some of the first successful mixed communities in the American West. Their home became a stopping point for travelers from both cultures, a place where differences were celebrated rather than feared. Yet their true legacy lives in the question their story poses to each of us. What would you do if a storm brought strangers to your door? When faced with people who look different, speak different languages, or come from worlds you've been taught to fear, would you choose safety and isolation, or would you risk everything for the radical act of compassion? In our own time, when the news seems full of division and mistrust, when it's easier to build walls than bridges, Margaret and Dakota's story offers us something precious. Proof that love really can transcend every boundary that fear tries to build. That families aren't just born, they're chosen, nurtured, and fought for by people brave enough to believe that what unites us is stronger than what divides us. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever been the stranger in need of help? Have you ever had the chance to be someone's unexpected rescue? Have you experienced the transformative power of being chosen as family by someone who didn't have to love you, but decided to anyway? Their story reminds us that sometimes the most profound love stories aren't about finding your perfect match, but about finding someone whose heart is brave enough to make room for your whole world. Sometimes the strongest families are forged not by shared blood, but by shared commitment to weather any storm together. We want to hear from you. In the comments below, share your stories of unexpected kindness, of strangers who became family, of moments when someone saw past surface differences to the person you really were. Because these stories matter, they remind us that Margaret and Dakota's courage isn't just historical curiosity. It's a choice available to each of us every single day. If this story touched your heart, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love really can conquer fear. Subscribe to Wild West Stories and ring that notification bell, because every week we're bringing you more incredible tales of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds that make us human. From blizzard rescues to unlikely romances, from cultural bridges to family formations that defy every convention, we're here to remind you that the Wild West was wild precisely because it was full of people brave enough to choose love over fear, hope over hatred, and family over everything else. Until next time, keep your hearts open to the strangers who might become your greatest blessings. And remember, sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the courage to save someone you've never met. This is Wild West Stories, where every storm clears the way for miracles to grow.